There's going to be a bigger video that covers more of this topic, but I just felt that this portion deserved its own video so it didn't get lost within the larger discussion. Anyways, so I just finished The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities by John Mearsheimer. And in it, he critiques very heavily and systematically what he calls liberal hegemony, which I'll get more into the when I do the actual bigger video on it. Basically, it just refers to the general ideology of the kind of the collective West leadership, the liberal institutionalists, the globalists, the neoconservatives, all those kind of related groups that have a liberal universalist mindset. So I use the term liberal universalist to include like neoconservatives, neoliberals. And it was funny because as I was reading through this, I was just like, a lot of this sounds very familiar. And a lot of this explains things that are going on with the whole Russo-Ukraine war that I'm just having a lot of trouble understanding and that just don't make any sense to me. And as he goes through and describes liberal hegemony and the assumptions it's built upon, I'm going to be honest, more and more it started to sound like my concept of the Ukraine cinematic universe. So I guess what I'm saying is, according to international relations scholar John Mearsheimer, the Ukraine cinematic universe is a legitimate analysis of global geopolitics. But anyway, so he takes quite a bit of time describing the worldview of, as I'm saying, the liberal universalist. And it's interesting to hear him describe it because a lot of it is very counter to the way I think, and probably the way a lot of you guys think, to the point where it's actually hard for me to really understand without it being explained to me, because it's just not the way that I think. Not just in terms of policies or morality, but just the metaphysical, epistemological worldview is just so different from what I'm used to on my day-to-day basis. It's actually kind of hard for me to grasp. But as he explained this, a lot of this stuff made more sense. So one of the things to keep in mind is idealism over realism is very important within this. He even says liberal hegemony is going up against realism in terms of this idealized internationalist system where everybody's going to achieve the end of history and sing kumbaya together is coming up against reality. Now, the thing about liberal universalism is it's not empirical. They might occasionally use empirical concepts, but it's not particularly important. Stuff like balance of power, which side has the bigger army, what the situation on the ground is, what your opponent's doing. It's very much grounded in a very idealistic perspective where all that really matters is moral principles. And to a certain extent, there's a belief that the moral principles that they believe in are teleological and that history is just moving towards them, so they don't really need to worry about the details. Once again, this is very strange to me because if you listen to any of my geopolitical videos, I'll talk about morality, but I also will talk a lot about the situation, how can we make the best of a bad situation, and you just kind of have to take the world as it is and try to do with it what you can. But it's not like that. The other thing that he points out, and once again, this is something that's very hard just given the way I think morally, is liberal internationalism or liberal universalism has a Manichaean morality, which means that it has two moral positions which are 100% different from each other, and there is no gray area between. So in their thinking, if something is liberal, and I talk about what liberal means more in the bigger presentation, but liberal is good and illiberal is bad. And every single thing is viewed through that lens. If something is illiberal, it's irrational, it's immoral, you can't trust it, you can't believe it. It is, and I'm trying to not be too dismissive or polemical in this, but it does very much come across as a worldview like a child would have watching a Disney movie, where it's like there's the good guy, there's the bad guy. The bad guy is just 100% evil. There's no room for any kind of moral ambiguity. There's nothing to do with the situation at hand or any of that stuff. That person is just evil and the good guy is good. And this is generally speaking how they apply to international politics is certain leaders will be good and certain leaders will be bad, and there's generally speaking not any sort of in between. And I will find this with a lot of liberal universalists is in a lot of cases they will say, like if you point out, well, that person may have been autocratic, they may have led a military coup, but they saved their country from total ruin, and so they kind of have a mixed record, or maybe they did the best they could under circumstances. Whereas in their perspective, it'll just be no. No, that person is 100% evil. And I think you can see this very much with the Zelensky-Putin divide, where Zelensky is 100% good and Putin is 100% evil. Now, what follows from this is illiberal actors are seen as morally illegitimate. So this means you cannot conduct diplomacy with them, because you can't conduct diplomacy with basically Satan. And this is also partially why they always bring up World War II, because Hitler is their Satan. So anyone who fits within the illiberal bad category is Hitler. And because Hitler couldn't be trusted to honor agreements, none of the people who they consider bad can be trusted to honor agreements. They kind of depersonalize them. They don't even really view them as humans anymore. And so you just can't negotiate with them. They assume the other side is just a 100% irrational actor. And once again, they don't consider what the empirical situation is on the ground. And Mearsheimer talks quite a bit about this in how they try to normally do regime change in countries that are completely unsuited for liberal democracy because they're militarily weak and it's easy to overthrow them. Whereas countries that it probably would work better in tend to be too militarily strong. Anyways, we have the cliche, and this was actually repeated a couple days ago by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of Europe, who said that Putin's going to lose because he's on the wrong side of history. So there's a teleological view of history that everything is moving towards global liberal democracy, that just it's a natural phenomenon that one day the world is going to be liberal and everywhere is going to have no war. And so to a certain extent, once again, and this is a non-empirical ideology, you can just rely on that. Just eventually you will win somehow, kind of like in a Disney movie or something like that, because history is flowing your direction. And even if you get briefly stopped, eventually you're just going to win by default because, once again, the course of history, and there's just this belief in it, and it's built up very strongly, and it's often used as a fairly useful demotivational tool against their opponents by making them internalize the whole concept of the inevitable flow of history towards liberal democracy. There's a concept of universalism of values. Mearsheimer talks a lot about this. Liberal democracy is universally desirable and applies to all societies. So they assume that the default ideology of every human being, regardless of the culture or country that they grow up in, is liberal democracy. All of them fundamentally want liberal democracy. And if they, and we, that kind of leads to the next one, if they say they don't, or they don't appreciate regime change, it's because of false consciousness. It's because of misinformation, coercion, they're uneducated, they've watched fake news, something like that. They have to come up with something to explain why someone's not going along with what they're saying. Because once again, it's a Manichaean idea. So either the person who doesn't agree with them is evil, or they're stupid, or there's something else that is preventing them from acknowledging the good. And I'm sorry if this sounds insulting and belittling and childish and stuff like that. It's just hard for me to kind of phrase it any other way. It's just so kind of strange and different from how the way I look at the world. And I'm not even like a moral relativist or anything. I'm a Christian, and I operate under Christian morals and ethics, but I acknowledge that just the world is a complicated place. Things are seldom 100% black and white. You just kind of do the best you can with the situation you're given. In this case, it just says you just do axiomatically what helps liberal democracy regardless of the consequences of it. It doesn't matter how many people die. It doesn't matter if it even makes sense. And so this brings us to the Ukraine cinematic universe. So this was the concept I came up with in response to the Ukrainian government releasing multiple trailers for their big spring offensive. And during this, obviously, I've talked about this many times, they announced where they were going to be attacking, what units they were going to be using, the number, like the date. They basically just gave all this stuff. And it looked like it was this big movie where they were going to succeed. And the assumption at the time, and I covered it then, is that the Russian troops were slaves. They didn't want to be there because Russia is not a liberal democracy, and they were not going to fight and die for Putin because Putin is evil, and their natural inclination towards liberal democracy would make them poor soldiers, whereas the Ukrainians are fighting for liberalism, so they would be able to succeed. And the plan was that they were just going to like attack. The Russians were going to run away. They were going to reach Crimea, and there was going to be a military and political collapse in Russia that would lead to regime change. And that starts to make more sense once you start to kind of look at it and go, no, it is actually how they viewed it. It's not like me not understanding the way they think. It's not even necessarily them being stupid or ignorant. It's just that is their worldview. They just assume things go that way because the Ukrainian soldiers have the flow of history. They're on the right side of history. So, and this is something you just see in a lot of cases. You have Iraq, you have Afghanistan, where there's just kind of similar assumptions that we just have to overthrow. And I talk about this more in the broader video. We just have to overthrow Saddam. The people will greet us as liberators. They'll all become liberal Democrats, and Iraq will just kind of fix itself. It is this very idealistic way of looking at the world that, once again, is just kind of foreign to me. So let's just kind of pull these two concepts together. So how does the current situation between Russia and Ukraine relate to this? So idealism over realism. And this is something that a lot of people talk about and they just don't seem to really understand how they can think that way. Is if you ever listen to Western leaders, they never really talk about things like industrial production, balance of forces, military training, like how many weapons Russia can make versus how many weapons the US can make. And kind of all these things are just kind of considered unimportant. All that really matters is that we support as long as it takes. The actual logistics of providing the aid to Ukraine is not important. It's just so long as we send more weapons, whatever that means, it's just going to resolve itself. It's just kind of the principle of sending them more weapons. It'll just kind of take care of itself. It's very odd. So that is one aspect of it. And that you can see this kind of continually throughout the war where it doesn't really matter what's happening. Russia's always 100% losing and Ukraine's almost always 100% winning, or some movie logic is going to happen. I remember there was the one article that said that Ukrainian soldiers just needed to achieve a 10-to-1 kill ratio and they would win the war. And they think stuff like that is possible. So another part of this is that if we look at this, the Manichaean morality, if you listen to them talk about this, Putin is 100% at fault. Ukraine and NATO did absolutely nothing to contribute to this crisis. Putin is invading Ukraine because he's evil, and there's no rational calculation at play. And if you listen to them talk about it, this is where Putler comes from. This is where everything is 1939. They don't consider Putin to be a human being, but they don't consider him like to be a complex figure who has national interests, who has his own set of priorities. and morals and values and stuff like that. It's not even that they think that it was unjustified or wrong or excessive. They are just not able to hear what he's saying when he talks. And you find this a lot of the time where you will have Western countries that will just negotiate between each other and then present an ultimatum to Russia and just expect them to accept it, but they won't talk to them because you don't talk to a mustache twirling villain. You don't talk to someone who is not a liberal in their view of what liberalism is and is therefore just an inherently irrational actor. Putin invaded Ukraine because he's evil. It's none of the other stuff even really matters. Once again, if we go back to this, there is the continual refusal to even consider negotiating with Putin. Sorry, I missed this actually. Part of the moral absolutism is that the only type of way a conflict can end is with an unconditional surrender. Because if your opponent is 100% evil and you can't trust them at all, even if they're in a bad position and even with like enforcement mechanisms, then the only real way you can resolve it is to demand unconditional surrender. And so that's kind of what happens now is I find wars either end in unconditional surrender or a status quo antebellum. They don't ever really seem to... I'm sure they sometimes end with negotiated settlements, but that seems to be more the pattern now, that there is never like a negotiated settlement. It just becomes a forever war. And this is what the Zelensky plan is Russia's unconditional surrender. This was reiterated a couple days ago. This has been reiterated for like 2 to 3 years. They are not willing to have any negotiation with Russia. They're not willing to talk to them. The only terms that they will accept is an unconditional surrender on Russia's part. We have the teleological view of history. This is the idea that Ukraine, the collective West, will win if they hold out long enough because they are on the right side of history. And Ursula even said that. So they just have to hold out, and eventually the course of history will overthrow Putin, and Zelensky will win, and that's how the war is just going to work out. It's just going to work out somehow. There's the whole universalism of values. This is when we get into the whole thing, like, why do a lot of these countries care so much what happens to Ukraine? It doesn't really affect them. Does it really affect like Portugal or Spain or the UK or France, what happens in Ukraine? It's because part of this worldview is that there's an ignoring of what Mearsheimer calls nationalism, but what I would call just kind of identity or group collective interests or something like that. Is they don't... It's very anti-particularist, and I talk about this in the bigger video. So in their conception, Ukraine not becoming a liberal society, and Russia invading and imposing whatever evil government they're going to on it, is in their mind the same basically as if Russia invaded their country and did the same things to them. So they take it extremely personally. And once again, because this is not a pragmatic ideology, this is not an ideology that looks at the actual like physical situation on the ground. How this kind of goes together is Russia is attacking Ukraine, therefore Russia is directly attacking us. And you can see that kind of rhetoric. Like you can see in the UK, they think Russia is going to invade constantly. I just think that's the way that they look at the world. And then, of course, we have the false consciousness. Anyone who disagrees with demanding an unconditional surrender from Russia are paid by Russia, or they just aren't even people. They're AIs, or they read fake news or something like that. And once again, it's a non-empirical ideology, so it doesn't really matter whether it reflects like reality or not. It just matters if it goes with the historical narrative. So hopefully you found that interesting. Hopefully I didn't sound too insulting. The longer video will be coming out in a couple days, but I thought that deserved to just be looked at on its own. So anyways, God bless. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.